A woman vanishes from her own home on an ordinary street in a small Scottish town. Her husband tells everyone she simply left him. Weeks pass. Then months. Then years. And the entire time he's living in that same house, sleeping in that same bed, telling anyone who asks the exact same story, she walked out, she's out there somewhere, she just doesn't want to be found. Except she was never out there at all. This is the story of Margaret Gardner, a woman whose body has never been found to this day, and the husband who spent years hiding, in plain sight, exactly what he'd done to her. Margaret Gardner lived on Sinclair Drive in Helensburgh, a coastal town on the Firth of Clyde, in Argyll and Bute, Scotland. The kind of quiet, respectable town where a missing wife doesn't stay a quiet story for long. She was married to John Gardner, a former Royal Navy man, someone with a background that on paper suggested discipline, structure, the kind of steady life that comes with military service. They had 2 grown children together, a daughter named Fiona and a son named Graham. In 2004, Margaret vanished. John's explanation was simple, and it's the explanation he stuck to for a long time. He said the 2 of them had argued. He said he'd driven her into Glasgow that day, dropped her off on Robertson Street, near Central Station, right in the heart of the city, and that she had chosen not to come home. He told police, and he told anyone else who asked, that Margaret had left him. For a while, that story held. Here's the detail that should stop you in your tracks, though, before any of this happened. Margaret had said something to her own colleagues at work, almost as a throwaway remark, the kind of dark joke people sometimes make without ever expecting it to mean anything. She told them, "If I ever go missing, dig up the back garden and you'll find me there." She said that, and then, not long after, she was gone. Police weren't fully convinced by John's story from the start. Inconsistencies started to surface, small gaps and contradictions in his account that didn't add up the way a simple story about a wife walking away from her marriage should add up. If Margaret had genuinely left of her own accord, where had she gone? Why had no one heard from her? Why did the timeline John kept offering shift slightly every time he was asked to repeat it? The investigation dragged on. And here is the part of this story that is genuinely disturbing to sit with. John Gardner continued living an ordinary life in that house on Sinclair Drive, the same house Margaret had vanished from, for a considerable length of time, maintaining his account, going about his days, while investigators worked to pull apart the story he'd built. Eventually, that story collapsed. According to the account John Gardner eventually gave, the truth was almost unbearably different from what he'd told police at the very start. He said that on the day Margaret died, the 2 of them had argued at lunchtime. He said they'd discussed separating. He said he told her he'd go and find a flat of his own, and then, according to his own account, he pushed her. She fell. She struck her head on the steps outside their own home. He said he checked for signs of life and found none. What he did next is the part of this case that turns it from a tragic domestic accident into something calculated and cold. According to his own confession, he didn't call for help. He didn't call the police. Instead, he says he got a towel, wrapped it around her body, and carried her into the house, laying her in the bath. Later, he wrapped her body in a sheet of polythene. He drove to a bridge on the A82, near Dumbarton, not far from Helensburgh, and he put her body into the river below. Then he went home, and according to his own account, he washed out the bath. He put his own blood-stained clothes, along with the towel he'd used, into the washing machine. He washed the polythene sheet he'd wrapped her in and threw it in the wheelie bin, along with the rest of the household rubbish. Every single one of those actions, the washing, the disposal, the calm, methodical clean-up, happened after his wife was already dead, carried out by a man who then walked back out into his own community and told everyone that Margaret had simply left him. When police finally moved to check his account of where he disposed of her body, they searched the River Leven, the river running beneath that bridge on the A82. Divers went into the water. The riverbed was dredged. Investigators searched the grimy floor of that river for any sign of human remains. They found nothing. To this day, Margaret Gardner's body has never been recovered. Not from the River Leven, not from anywhere else. Despite a formal search, despite divers, despite dredging equipment brought in specifically to comb the riverbed where John himself said he'd left her, nothing was ever found. That absence of a body did something significant to how this case was ultimately prosecuted. John Gardner was tried, but not for murder in the way most people would expect. He was found guilty of culpable homicide, a charge under Scots law that sits below murder, reflecting a lesser degree of intent or premeditation. He was sentenced to imprisonment, reported at the time as a term of several years, and he did not serve the full length of that sentence. He was released, according to reports at the time, after serving roughly half of it. Let that sink in for a second. A man pushes his wife. She dies. He spends the following hours calmly disposing of her body, cleaning his own house, washing away every trace of what had happened, and then tells the world she simply walked out on her marriage, and the legal system, working with the evidence available and his own account of events, which conveniently could never be checked against a body that was never found, ultimately convicted him of the lesser charge and released him after serving only part of his sentence. For the people of Helensburgh, this case did not stay quiet after John Gardner walked free. Locals continued to talk about it for years. Some of that talk drifted, as it often does in cases like this, into rumour and urban legend rather than confirmed fact. One particularly grim rumour that circulated through the town claimed that fragments of Margaret's remains had turned up in the most unlikely and horrifying place imaginable, inside a tumble dryer. That rumour has never been substantiated. It appears to be exactly what it sounds like, a piece of dark local folklore that grew up around a genuinely unresolved tragedy, rather than anything based on confirmed evidence. But its very existence tells you something about how deeply this case embedded itself in the psyche of the town, how much unresolved horror a community can carry when a woman disappears from her own home and her body is never found. There's another detail that speaks to just how unresolved this case remains. In 2015, more than a decade after Margaret vanished, a passer-by walking near Tarbet Pier on the shores of Loch Lomond noticed something in the water, bone fragments, sticking out where the pier meets the loch. Police treated the discovery seriously enough to launch an investigation, examining whether these fragments might finally be the remains that had eluded searchers for over a decade. Forensic analysis suggested the bones likely belonged to a woman aged 35 or over, a detail specific enough to reopen, however briefly, the possibility that Margaret Gardner had finally been found. She hadn't. The remains were formally ruled out as belonging to Margaret. Whoever those bone fragments belonged to, they were connected to some other unresolved case entirely, a separate tragedy layered onto an already tragic search. For Margaret's family, that must have been its own particular kind of anguish. A moment of hope, briefly rekindled after more than 10 years, only to be extinguished once forensic analysis confirmed those bones were not hers. Let's talk about that culpable homicide conviction itself. Because under Scots law, it occupies a very particular space, and understanding it tells you a lot about why this case still frustrates people who follow it closely today. In Scotland, culpable homicide is roughly equivalent to manslaughter in English law. It applies where a death has been caused unlawfully, but where the prosecution either cannot prove, or the jury isn't satisfied beyond reasonable doubt that the killing involved the specific intent required for a murder conviction. It's a charge that exists precisely for situations that sit in a grey area, genuine accidents that occurred during unlawful or reckless behaviour, fights that escalated further than intended, deaths that resulted from an assault without a clear intention to kill. John Gardner's own account, a push during an argument, an accidental fall, a fatal head injury, fits that grey area almost perfectly, assuming the jury believed it. And that's really the crux of the entire case. The jury was asked to weigh an account given entirely by the one person who benefited most from being believed, against physical evidence that, without a recovered body, could never fully confirm or contradict what he was describing. For Margaret's family, sitting through that trial must have been an almost impossible experience. Imagine listening to the man who caused your mother's death describe, in careful, composed detail, exactly how she died, how he handled her body afterward, how he cleaned his own house in the hours that followed, all while knowing that no one could ever check his account against her own injuries, her own account, or any physical trace of what actually happened between the two of them in those final moments. There's something particularly difficult about a case like this for the victim's own children to process. Fiona and Margaret Gardner didn't just lose their mother. They lost her without a body, without a funeral in the traditional sense, without a grave to visit on her birthday or the anniversary of her death. And the only account of what happened to her came from their own father, delivered on his own terms, at the pace and in the version he chose to offer, long after his first story had already collapsed under scrutiny. And then, after all of that, they were faced with a father who served only part of his sentence before walking free, who sold them the very house their mother had died in, and who went on, in the years that followed, to build an entirely new life for himself, complete with a new marriage, while their own mother remained, and remains, unaccounted for. What happened to John Gardner after his release is, in its own way, one of the most unsettling threads running through this entire story. He did not disappear from public life in shame. He rebuilt. Reports at the time noted that he sold the family home on Sinclair Drive, the very house where Margaret had died, to his own two children, Fiona, and by then in her 30s, and Graham, in his early 30s as well, for a sum reported at around £33,000. The house where their mother's life had ended, sold by their own father to them, presumably so that the property could remain within the family rather than pass to strangers. John Gardner went on to remarry. Reports describe him meeting a new partner and eventually marrying, years after his release, moving on with a new life entirely separate from the one he'd shared with Margaret. For a man convicted of culpable homicide in connection with his own wife's death, whose account of events was the only version of the story anyone has ever had, given that Margaret herself was never able to offer her own, that ability to simply rebuild a new life, a new marriage, a fresh start, stands in stark and uncomfortable contrast to the fact that his first wife's body remains missing to this day, and that her children have never had anywhere to visit. No grave, no memorial, nothing but a house that was once their family home and is now owned by strangers. Let's go back and slow down on how investigators actually got from missing wife to conviction, because that gap is where the real forensic work of this case happened. When someone goes missing and their partner is the last person to see them, police don't jump straight to an arrest. They have to build a case, piece by piece, often with no body, no crime scene in the traditional sense, and no forensic starting point beyond a house that looks, on the surface, completely ordinary. That's exactly the situation Strathclyde police found themselves in 2004. No body. No confirmed crime scene. Just a husband's account of a wife who'd left him after an argument, and a nagging sense, the kind experienced investigators develop over years of casework, that something in his story didn't sit right. But what do you actually do in a case like that? You start with the story itself, and you pull at every thread. Where exactly did he say he dropped her off? Robertson Street, near Glasgow Central Station. A busy, heavily trafficked area of the city. Did anyone see her there? Any CCTV, any witness, any single confirmation that Margaret Gardner had actually been standing on that street on the day her husband claimed. If a woman is dropped off in one of the busiest parts of a major Scottish city in broad daylight, you'd expect at least some trace of her passing through. Someone who saw her, a camera that caught her, a friend she might have called from a phone box or a shop. None of that trace ever appeared. That absence, the complete lack of any confirmation that Margaret had ever actually been where her husband said she was, is often one of the first cracks investigators look for in a missing person case that's secretly a homicide. It's very difficult to fabricate a person's entire trail through a public space convincingly. Real movement through a city leaves real evidence, footage, receipts, witnesses. A fabricated account usually leaves nothing at all, because the person describing it is making it up, describing a scene that never actually happened. At the same time, investigators would have turned their attention to the house itself, to Sinclair Drive. This is where the case eventually cracked open, not through some single dramatic discovery, but through the same patient, methodical process that defines so many of these investigations. Sustained pressure on an inconsistent story, combined with whatever forensic examination of the property itself could still yield, months and years after the fact. Houses hold evidence longer than people expect. Blood, even after determined cleaning, can often still be detected using chemical reagents designed specifically to react with even trace amounts of hemoglobin left behind on surfaces that look, to the naked eye, completely clean. Whether or not that specific technique was what ultimately cracked John Gardner's story in this case isn't something I can confirm with certainty from the available public record, but it reflects exactly the kind of methodical, scene-based work that underpins cases like this one. The recognition that cleaning a house thoroughly enough to satisfy the human eye is very different from cleaning it thoroughly enough to defeat forensic chemistry. Eventually, faced with an accumulating weight of inconsistency and, in all likelihood, forensic evidence from his own home that his cleanup had not fully erased, John Gardner's original account collapsed. That's when the second story emerged, the one involving the argument, the push, the fall, the bath, and the river. Here's the uncomfortable truth about that second account. Once it was offered, investigators faced an entirely new problem. They now had a confession of sorts, but a confession that, if accepted at face value, described an accidental death rather than a deliberate killing, and they had no body to independently verify any part of it against. No injuries to examine, no forensic pathology to confirm or contradict the specific claim that Margaret had died from a fall rather than something more violent. Everything from that point forward rested on how much weight a Scottish court was willing to place on an account given entirely by the one person responsible for making sure no other account would ever be possible. This is precisely why the search of the River Leven mattered so much to the case, and why its failure to produce a body left such a lasting, unresolved shadow over the entire process. Had divers found Margaret's remains exactly where John Gardner said he'd left her, forensic pathologists would have been able to examine her skull, her injuries, and determine with far greater confidence whether her death was consistent with a fall down a set of steps, or with something considerably more violent that a fall alone couldn't explain. Without that confirmation, the court was left weighing his account against itself, unable to test it against the one piece of physical evidence that could have definitively supported or demolished it. The dredging operation on the River Leven represents one of the more sustained and resource-intensive search efforts undertaken in this case. Police divers, working in cold, murky water beneath the A82 bridge near Dumbarton, searched a riverbed described by those involved as grimy and difficult to examine visually, relying heavily on touch and systematic grid searching rather than clear sightlines. Dredging equipment was brought in to work through sediment that could have settled over remains in the years since 2004, an operation that required significant coordination and expense, and that ultimately came back empty. Think about what that means for the investigators who worked this case. They believed, with good reason, that they had the right location, drawn directly from the suspect's own detailed confession. They committed real resources, divers, dredging equipment, weeks of searching, based on that belief, and they still came away with nothing. That kind of outcome doesn't necessarily mean the confession was false. Rivers are unpredictable, powerful things, capable of carrying remains for miles downstream, burying them under shifting sediment, or breaking them down entirely over the span of years. But it does mean that, from a purely evidentiary standpoint, investigators were never able to close the loop on John Gardner's own account of what he'd done. Let's sit with the geography of this case for a moment, because it matters. Helensburgh sits on the Firth of Clyde, a town with genuine natural beauty around it. Hills, water, the kind of scenery that draws visitors and retirees looking for a quieter pace of life than Glasgow, only a short distance away. The River Leven, where John Gardner says he disposed of Margaret's body, flows out from Loch Lomond itself, one of Scotland's most iconic and heavily visited natural landmarks, down toward the Clyde. The A82, the road he says he drove that night, is one of the main arteries connecting the west of Scotland's central belt to the highlands beyond. A road driven by tourists, commuters, and locals alike every single day. That's part of what makes this case so quietly disturbing. The bridge where John Gardner says he disposed of his wife's body isn't some remote, hidden location accessible only to someone with detailed local knowledge. It's on one of the most heavily used roads in the entire region. A road millions of people have driven along without ever knowing what one local man claimed to have done from it one night in 2004. There's a haunting postscript to this story that locals in the area still discuss. The house on Sinclair Drive where Margaret died has new owners now. Its history largely, if not entirely, forgotten by anyone who didn't live through the original investigation. But directly beyond its front hedge lies a stretch of cycle path, a stretch of land that back in 2004 was still an active building site, still under construction. All torn up earth and rubble at exactly the time Margaret disappeared. Some locals who remember the original case are convinced to this day that Margaret Gardner's body was never taken to that river at all. That instead, it lies somewhere beneath that rubble, beneath what is now an ordinary cycle path that people walk and ride along every single day without any idea of what might be underneath them. That is, of course, speculation. Exactly the kind of theory that grows up naturally around any case where the physical evidence, the body itself, was never actually found and confirmed. John Gardner's own account, the push, the fall, the bath, the river, is the only version of events anyone has ever had to work with, precisely because the one person who could have told a different story, or confirmed his account, or offered any correction to it, is the one person who never got the chance to speak again. That's really the core of what makes this case so difficult, even now, more than 2 decades later. Everything the public knows about Margaret Gardner's final hours comes from the man who caused her death. Every detail, the argument, the push, the fall, the bath, the river, comes from John Gardner himself, offered on his own terms, at his own pace, with no one left who can confirm or contradict a single word of it. Margaret cannot correct the record. She cannot say whether it happened exactly the way he described, whether there was more violence involved than he admitted to, or whether the accidental framing of her death was accurate at all. That single, unshakable fact, that the only surviving account of how Margaret Gardner died comes entirely from the person responsible for her death, is precisely why this case carries the particular unease that it does. A culpable homicide conviction assumes a version of events that cannot be independently verified against her own body, her own injuries, or her own account of what actually happened between the two of them that day. Margaret Gardner told her own colleagues, in an offhand remark that would later feel almost prophetic, that if she ever went missing, they should dig up her own back garden to find her. She was, it seems, at least somewhat aware that something in her marriage carried real risk, that her own home held dangers she was willing to joke about, even if she never fully articulated what those dangers actually were, or took any action to remove herself from them before it was too late. Her family has spent more than 2 decades now living with a version of her death that they can never fully verify. A husband and father who told them one story, then told police a different story once his lies collapsed, and who has never faced a jury's judgment on the full, unvarnished truth of what happened to their mother. Because that truth left with her, and it was never coming back. Let's talk about why cases like this one continue to draw attention decades later, long after the original headlines have faded and the people directly involved have largely moved out of public view. Part of it is the simple, unresolved nature of the central mystery. A body that has never been found leaves a case permanently open in the public imagination, even after a conviction has technically closed it in the eyes of the law. As long as Margaret Gardner's remains are somewhere out there, in a river, beneath a cycle path, or in some location no one has ever thought to search, there remains the theoretical possibility, however remote, that new information could still emerge, that a construction project, a flood, a chance discovery by a dog walker or a fisherman could finally bring her home to her family after decades of uncertainty. That's precisely what happened, however briefly, with the 2015 discovery near Tarbet Pier. For a short window of time, investigators and the wider public alike had genuine reason to believe this decades-old mystery might finally be resolved. The fact that it wasn't, that those bones belonged to someone else entirely, doesn't diminish how significant that moment must have felt for anyone who had followed Margaret's case from the very beginning. It's a reminder that cases like this one don't simply fade quietly into history. They resurface, unpredictably, whenever new evidence turns up anywhere near the geography connected to the original case, forcing everyone involved to relive the uncertainty all over again. There's also something about the specific texture of this case. The domestic setting, the ordinary house on an ordinary street, the husband who maintained a lie for as long as he could before switching to a second, more calculated account. That resonates with a particular kind of unease shared by so many similar cases across Britain. It's the same unease that runs through so many stories like this one. The recognition that the person closest to a victim, the one who shares their home, their bed, their daily life, is so often the person who ultimately causes their death. And that the outward appearance of an ordinary marriage, an ordinary house, an ordinary town, offers no real guarantee of what might actually be happening behind closed doors. Margaret Gardner's own words to her colleagues, the offhand remark about digging up the back garden, have taken on an almost eerie significance in the years since her death, precisely because of how closely they seem to gesture toward exactly the kind of danger she may have sensed, even if she never fully articulated it or acted to protect herself from it. It's a detail that true crime audiences and casual observers alike tend to fixate on, because it captures something that so many similar cases share: a victim who had some instinctive sense, however vague, that something in their own home carried genuine risk, long before that risk was ever confirmed by tragedy. There's a strange quiet symmetry to how this story continues to circulate today. The case has been picked up by true crime podcasts. It's been written about by local historians and journalists, piecing together exactly what's known and what remains rumour. It resurfaces periodically whenever new bone fragments are discovered anywhere near Loch Lomond or the surrounding waterways, each time raising the same fragile hope for Margaret's family, and each time, so far, ending in the same disappointment. What endures, more than anything else, is the fundamental unresolved nature of this case. A woman disappeared from her own home in 2004. Her husband told a story that later fell apart under police scrutiny. He then offered a second story, one involving a fall, a bath, a river, and a methodical clean-up of his own house. A story that has never been independently verified, because the one piece of physical evidence that could confirm or contradict it, Margaret's own body, has never been found. He was convicted of the lesser charge of culpable homicide, served part of his sentence, was released, sold the family home to his own children, and went on to remarry and build an entirely new life. Margaret Gardner, meanwhile, has no grave. Her children have no fixed place to visit her, And somewhere in Scotland, whether beneath the River Leven, beneath a cycle path that didn't exist when she vanished, or somewhere else entirely that no one has ever thought to search, her body remains exactly where it has been for more than 20 years, missing, unrecovered, and known only, if it is known at all, to the one man who has never had to answer for the full truth of what actually happened to her. Margaret Gardner deserved better than the ending she got. A marriage that turned fatal, a husband who chose concealment over honesty in the immediate aftermath of her death, and a legal system that, working with the only account anyone was ever given, could only convict him of the lesser charge available to it. Her case remains a stark reminder that the truth of what happens inside a marriage often belongs entirely to the two people living it, and that when one of them is silenced permanently, the surviving account, however carefully constructed, however calmly delivered, is never truly the whole story. It is simply the only story anyone was left to tell. Her family still waits for the day, if it ever comes, when that whole story is finally recovered and Margaret Gardner is finally brought home. Until then, she remains one of Scotland's quietest, most enduring unsolved mysteries. A woman who vanished from her own street in an ordinary Scottish town, whose husband walked free after telling only part of the truth, and whose final resting place, wherever it actually is, has never once been confirmed in more than 20 years of searching, dredging, and hoping. That's the story of Margaret Gardner, and it remains, in the most literal sense possible, unfinished.